Hey guys, and welcome to my tutorial on how to create a very simple bow and arrow for your game. So I try to keep things as simple as possible. Obviously, I don't have any AAA quality art here. These are just things I could find online. Um, but all the logic behind creating a bow and arrow and firing it and retrieving arrows and all that stuff, I'll be showing you guys how to do. Hopefully you guys have some better assets than I do. But I just made the arrow kind of bright and red so you guys could see it easily in the video. But anyways, this is what it will look like when we're done. So we'll have a bow, which you can pull back, and if you left click, it will fire. And if you kind of, let go of right click before it's fully charged, it will go back to a rested state. And if you fire it at something, it will, as you can see, get stuck in it. Don't even go through it. So it kind of depending on what it hits, it will get stuck at that correct angle. And you can see it actually is attached to this board. So if I knock this over, you see the arrows fall with it, which is kind of neat. Let me do one thing. And you can go retrieve the arrows. So if you see in the bottom left, it shows how many arrows I have. So if I go and pick up these arrows, I can get them back, which is something cool I added. One other thing to note is the arrows will go further based on how far back you have the bow charged. So if you only charge a little and then fire, you'll see it'll drop pretty quickly. But if you pull it all the way back and then fire, it will obviously go much further. So that's everything I'll be showing you guys how to do. Again, I try to keep this as simple as possible, just so you guys could follow along, and there wasn't anything else going on that was going to distract or take away from the bow and arrow logic. So we're going to be doing this completely from scratch. So I'm going to launch a new version of Unreal, and I am currently on 4.24.3. So I recommend being on that one or newer. And the first thing we're going to do is add in these assets. Now, if you already have your own bow and arrow, then by all means you can use those instead. There's a few specific things about them that will have to be the same as the ones I have, and I'll tell you what those are. But hopefully you have some better assets to use. If not, feel free to use the ones that I'm giving you. There'll be a link in the description of this video to a download to all the assets that I'm using. All right, so once we have this select or create new project window, let's go ahead and create a new game. Go ahead and hit next. And we're going to use the first person template. So select that and hit next. And we want blueprints, and we don't need any starter content. And I'll just call this bow tutorial, and then go ahead and create the project and give this a second to load up. All right, and I'm just going to go ahead and move this over here so I can reference it, like so. All right, so like I said, the first thing we're going to need to do is import our assets. So back here in the content directory, let's just create a new folder, call it assets. And inside of here is where we'll drop our assets. So again, in the description of this video, there'll be a link to a folder that you can download. And I'm trying to find it on my computer. Okay, so it should look something like this. It just has an arrow FBX and a bow FBX. So if you want to just grab, well, actually, let's make folders just to keep it a little neater. So we'll make a new folder for arrow and another new folder for the bow. So inside of the arrow, we'll drag in the arrow FBX. And I believe you can just leave all this as default. So one thing I want to mention real quick here about the arrow, if you're using your own arrow, just if you double click and take a look at it. So if you are using your own arrow, there's a few things that are important if you want to be able to follow along with this tutorial. The arrow needs to be facing along the x-axis. So I know it's a little hard to see because it kind of blends in with the grid here, but it's going this way if you follow my mouse. And the origin of it is the base of the arrow. So it may be able to be a little bit more obvious if I drag it into the world here. So this is the arrow, and you can see the base of it, like where the feathers are, is where the origin is, and then it's going along the x-axis. And those are both really important things to make sure that your arrow also follows those standards if you're going to be following this tutorial. And then for this material, again, like I said, I just have pretty simple assets here. I don't have anything fancy. We'll just make a nice bright red color so that we can see it a little easier. And apply and save. And now if we go back and look at arrow, it's a little easier to see. So that's the arrow, pretty straightforward. The bow is also pretty straightforward. So let's grab the bow and drag that into the bow folder. And one thing I need to do with this bow for in my case, is I need to rotate it -90 on the Z, and I'll show you why. It's because it needs to be facing a specific way. So I'm going to rotate it -90 on the Z. I think that's correct. And then when I import it, if we go and we take a look at it, the really important thing about the bow is that it needs to be facing the x-axis. So if you look down here in the bottom left, it kind of shows you what the directions are, and you can see it's facing down the x-axis. And it's, again, it'll be a little bit easier to see if I drag it into the world. You can see it's facing along this positive x-axis. So the bow and the arrow both need to point along that axis, and the origin of the arrow needs to be like at the base of the arrow where the feathers are. Those are the two things that are really important if you're following along with this tutorial and you have your own bow and arrow. And then one more thing that's important is I'm trying to tell you guys this up front so you don't end up getting stuck later realizing you don't have the correct assets. The other thing you'll need is you'll need 2 animations, one for when the bow is idle, which is basically just this, and one for the bow being fully charged. If you don't already have those animations, which I actually don't have them, we're just going to go ahead and make them in Unreal. And in order to make them, your bow needs to have some bones that go up the spine, because we're basically going to be taking these bones, we're going to be rotating them like so. Not exactly like this, but we're going to be rotating them, and then we're going to be creating a new animation from that. So if your bow has those things, then feel free to use your own bow, otherwise you can use this one. Okay, so I think we got all of that out of the way, and we got all of our assets imported. The next thing we're going to want to do is start working on our third-person character, because you can see if we run it right now, let me just go ahead and delete this. We have a gun, which we don't really want. Let me get rid of this floating arrow as well. So we want to get rid of the gun, and we want to replace it with a bow. So if we click on our little guy over here, and we click over here to edit his blueprint, there's a few things in here we don't need. So coming over here to the viewport tab, we don't need this VR marker, or the VR gun, or this, or this, or this, or this, or this. So we pretty much only want these top 4. The capsule, the air component is fine, it's not going to hurt anything, the mesh, and the first-person camera. And if we compile and save, you'll see we get some errors down here, and that's just because we deleted some things that it was using. So if we click on these, it's going to bring us to the event graph, and a lot of this stuff we just don't need at all. Like spawning projectiles, we don't need that. We're going to be writing our own little spawn projectile function, so we can just go ahead and delete this whole bottom part. Compile and save again. See up here we get some errors inside of begin play. And all this is doing is setting up like VR stuff, which for this tutorial, we don't care about any of that. So we're just going to go ahead and delete this. And we also don't need this reset VR stuff. And compile, we got one little error left. Let's see where it is. Inside of the construction script, we have an error. And this is attaching the gun, I think. But again, we don't need this. So let's delete that. And if we compile and save this now, we should not get any errors. And if we go ahead and run it, you'll see we no longer have a gun, but we can still walk around and look, and everything looks pretty good. The other thing I want to do is get rid of this crosshair, because we're not going to need that. So let's just come, I think it's called HUD. We're going to be making our own little HUD anyways, so we can just delete this. And just hit force delete. And there we go. So now we run it. Everything is as we need it to be before we can get started. All right, so the first thing we're going to want to do is I guess we can set up our inputs first. So if you come up here to edit, edit project settings, and you go to input on the left, there will be a section for action mappings and axis mappings. We really only care about the action mappings. We want to add one for firing, which actually already is one for that. So we're just going to use that one. And we want to add one for charging up the bow. So you can leave these in here, these other ones if you want. Just click this plus button and rename it to charge. So this is like charging the bow, like pulling back the bow. And we're going to bind this to the right mouse button, like so. And now back inside of the third-person character, inside of the event graph, we can right-click and say input action charge and input action fire. So these are the only 2 events we need. These are the only 2 inputs that we're going to be using for this. But in order to fill these out, we need to actually create the bow class first. So let's go ahead and do that now. So let's come back to the content directory and clear our filters. And let's see. We'll just do it right here in the root directory to keep things simple. So let's just right click and we're going to create a new blueprint class. And we want it to be of type actor. And we'll call this BP underscore bow. So if we double click and open this up, we obviously want to make it have a bow right here. So to do that, it's going to be a skeletal mesh because it's rigged and it has bones to it. So we'll say add component, and we'll search for the skeletal mesh component, and we'll just call this the bow mesh. And then over here on the right, if you search for the bow that we just imported and select it, you'll see the bow pops up. And again, it's really important that the bow is facing along this x-axis. If you're using your own bow, make sure you rotate it in Maya or Blender or whatever you're using, or rotate it on import so that it's facing along the x-axis. So it'll just make your life 100 times simpler. Okay, so we got the bow imported. So we want to be able to charge this bow. So if we come back to the event graph, we're going to create two little events here. We can actually delete these. I don't think we really need them. So if you right click in the event graph and search for add custom event, we're going to make one called begin charge, and we're going to make another one called end charge. So add custom event called end charge. So these are going to be used when you're holding down the right key. So if you're holding down the right key, begin charge will get called, and then if you let go, end charge will get called. And that's what will make the bow appear as if it's being pulled back. And then we want another one for stop charge. So add custom event, stop charge. And you'll see what this one's going to be used for, but this is to like totally stop the charging of the bow. We're going to call this when we fire it. Just add it for now. I'll show you what it does here in a second. And then the very last one we need is for firing the bow or shooting the bow. So add custom event, and we'll just call it fire. So these are the events we're going to need for the bow. So the bow kind of is going to work based on a timeline that's going to determine how much the bow is charged versus how much it's not charged. So if we right click, we'll say add timeline. Yeah, add timeline. And we'll call this the charge timeline. And if we double click on this, we can edit it. So let's double click on it. So inside of here, we essentially want to make a float that goes from 0 to some number, and some number being how long do we want to take it to be fully charged. And in the demo I showed you, I decided on 1.5 seconds. I just felt like that seemed like a good amount of time for the bow to fully be charged. So we'll just go with that here. But again, feel free to edit this to be whatever you want. So we'll say 1.5 for the length up here at the top. And then we want to add a float track. So let's add one of those. And let's just call it the charge amount. And again, we want it to start at 0. So right click and add key at current float. And we'll just set the time and the value to 0. And then just somewhere over here on the right, doesn't really matter where, add another one. And then up here we can edit it. So the X we want to be 1.5 and the Y value we want to be 1. And then if you click these two little buttons to the left here, it will kind of focus the two nodes that you created. And this is pretty close to what we want, but this is obviously just a linear graph. We would like it to be a little bit more smooth so it's not so linear. So if we kind of zoom out a little and highlight both of these, and then right click and select user, I think. Yeah. So if you select user, it will kind of add this curve for you. But what we want, more natural bow curve, is to have it go up like this almost. So it starts out fast and then it kind of slows down as you get to the end. And you can play with this once you have it finished, but some sort of arch like this is what we're looking for. All right, so we can go ahead and compile and save that. And then we're going to come back to our event graph. So essentially what we're going to do here is when begin charge is called, we're going to eventually call this play, but there's one thing we want to do before we just go ahead and start charging it, is we want to make sure it actually has an arrow inside of it and ready to shoot. So we're going to come over here and, well, actually we can't do that yet because we don't have an arrow class. So I guess before we can really continue on this part, we're going to have to come back to this in a second. We're going to have to create the arrow class first. So let's just compile and save this real quick. And back here where we made the bow, let's just do this same thing again, right click, make a new blueprint class off of actor, and call it BP_arrow. And just real quick inside of here, we will add a static mesh, and this is going to represent the arrow. Now, we actually want to replace the default scene root with the static mesh, and you can do that by dragging the static mesh onto the default scene root, and you'll see you'll replace it. And the reason we need to do that is because later, when we go to shoot the arrow, we're going to be adding a projectile movement component to this class, and the way the projectile movement component works is it expects the root node to be the thing that you want to be projecting or shooting, right? So it needs to be the static mesh, which is going to be the arrow. And so that's a very important step. Make sure your arrow class has the static mesh as the root component. So once that's set up, we can come over here and set the static mesh to the arrow. And you can see there's our arrow. And again, very important that the arrow's origin is down here by the feathers, and it's pointing along the positive x-axis. Okay, so we'll just leave that for now and go back to the bow. So again, we only want to start charging the bow if we actually have an arrow inside of the bow. So over here on the left, we'll create a new variable. So click this little variable button and call it arrow. And click right here. We can change the type of it to BP_arrow. So this arrow is the arrow that is currently inside of the bow. If there's no arrow in the bow, then this will just be null or empty or invalid, essentially. Okay. All right, so we want to drag in this arrow and say get arrow. And then if we actually right click right here, there's an option to convert to validated get, which is just kind of a simpler way to check if it's valid. So if we click that, it converts it to this type of node. And again, we want to make sure that it is valid. So if it is valid, then we'll go ahead and play. And we want to do the same thing for in charge. So drag it down here, or copy and paste it down here. And if it's valid, we want to call reverse. So, and the reason we're calling reverse is because if you let go of right click, we want the timeline to reverse. We want the bow to uncharge and, start going back to its normal default state. And when stop gets called, we want to do two things. So let's create a sequence. So I'm going to hold down S and then left click to create a sequence. You can also create this by searching for sequence and selecting it from here. So we create the sequence. The first thing we want to do is call stop, so the timeline stops, and then we want to reset it to 0. And you can do that by calling set new time, and then it takes whatever value is here, and 0 is actually what we want, so we can just leave it as 0. All right, so, and then the fire event, we're going to be coming back to fill this out later, but actually I guess we can just leave it as empty for right now and just focus on the charging, and we'll get to the shooting later. So one thing we need to do before we can actually call this is, again, our arrow is never actually being set anywhere. So we need a way for the arrow to this arrow to get set to something. So we're going to create a function, one more function down here actually. So add custom event, and we'll just call it reload. And when this is called, we will essentially set this arrow to something. So to do that, we need to actually create an arrow so we can set it to it. So we'll right click and say spawn actor from class. And oops. And the class we want to spawn is BP_arrow. And we don't really care where we spawn it. So if you just try to compile it right now, it's going to yell at you because it doesn't like that spawn transform is not hooked up. But if you just right click on it and split it, it's totally fine with it. So just go ahead and do that. So we're just spawning it at the origin basically because we're going to attach it immediately. So just spawn it at the origin, and then we're going to want to save a reference to it. Actually, we already have one, sorry. So drag in this arrow, and we want to use the set. So we'll save a copy of it. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to attach the arrow to the bow. Now, if we go and we look at our bow real quick, so inside of here we have this string mid bone, and I probably should have mentioned this at the beginning of the tutorial, but you actually also need a bone for the middle of the string because that's where we're going to be attaching the arrow to. So if you actually take a look at this bone, though, we don't want to attach it directly to this bone, because if you can tell, the forward axis of this bone is actually facing that way. And so if we attach it to this bone, the arrow is going to be going perpendicular to the bow. So what we want to do is we want to create a socket off of this bone. So if you right click and say add socket, and then we can rename this to arrow attach socket. And then just to make sure it looks correct, you can right click and add preview asset and search for arrow. And so this is just a preview asset if you've never seen one of these before. We're not actually adding the arrow to the bow right now. We're just saying what it would look like if we were to attach it. And so you can see, this is what I was talking about. Since the parent bone is facing the wrong way, the socket by default faces the wrong way. So all we need to do is take this socket and just rotate it so it's facing the right way. So we'll just rotate it 90 degrees. And so now it's going the correct way. And again, I'm just using some really cheap art. A real bow obviously wouldn't go, or the arrow wouldn't go straight through the middle of the bow, but mine does, because I don't have any cool art. Okay, so now that we have that set up, we can just file and save. And if we come back to our BP bow, so when we reload it, we create the arrow, we save a copy of the arrow, and then we want to attach the arrow to the bow. So we can say attach to component. And so this is attaching the arrow to whatever we pass here. So we want to attach the bow mesh to the parent. And the socket name is the one we just created. So arrow attach socket. And we want to snap to target, and keep world for the scale. Okay, so let's actually get something kind of working here. Let's get this reload. Let's get this reload function being called so we can see that things are kind of working. So back in our third-person blueprint, which I closed, let me open it back up again. So back inside of here, inside of our begin play, we want to set a few things up. The first thing we want to do is we want to add the bow to our character, and then we want to reload the bow using that reload function we just wrote. So up here at the top, we'll say, I think it's called begin play. Yep. So begin play. Like I said, we want to spawn the bow, so spawn actor from class. And again, we're just going to split this so that it will compile. And we want to search for the BP underscore bow. And we're just going to say always spawn, ignore collision. And just to be safe, let me double check that the bow doesn't have any collision on it, because we don't want any collision on the bow. So if you go back to the bow real quick, just double checking that the bow mesh, okay, it's set to no collision. That's good. Just want to double check that. So it's going to spawn, and then we want to save a copy of this bow. So we will promote this to a variable, and we can just call this the bow. And we want to attach the bow to the camera, actually, because if we look up, we want the bow to kind of move up in the view with us. So we're going to say a bow attach to component, and the parent we're going to attach to is our first person camera, and we want to use snap to target and snap to target on these, and keep world for the scale. Let's drag this up a little bit. So now our bow is attached to the camera, but if we play it right now, you'll see that, well, we're actually, the bow is kind of inside of us. If I go to this view real quick, just to show you guys, F8. So our character is actually like right here where the string is, but the bow is there. So we want to put the bow kind of in front of us and to the side a little bit. So to do that, we can just say bow set actor relative location, and so this is relative to the camera. And again, you can play with these numbers. The ones I used in the little thing I showed at the beginning was 100 forward, 40 to the right, and negative 20 down. So if we run it now, we can see our bow is in front of us, and it stays with us wherever we look. And then finally, we want to call the reload function. So we'll drag in bow, and we'll say reload. Hook it up like so. So now if we run this, you can see our arrow is inside of our bow. It's actually, the arrow is a little tinier than it was in the demonstration, and the only reason it is because in the demonstration I scaled it up so you can see it a little bit better, just for the sake of the tutorial. If you want to do that on your side, I just went to the bow and then inside of the construction script. So we want to say static mesh, set relative scale, 3D, and we want to set it to like 1, and then 5 and 5, or whatever big you want it to be, just so you can see it a little bit easier, or if you just want to change the size of it. So you might notice something already. We're kind of colliding with the arrow at this point, and that's totally fine. We'll fix that later. As I try to walk around, it's like pushing me, but we'll fix that as it goes on. All right, so back in the third person character, we want to do something here because we don't want to just reload the bow right off the bat. We want to make sure that we actually have the correct amount of arrows. Like, we want to make sure we at least have some arrows to reload the bow. So over here on the left, we're going to make a little variable to keep track of how many arrows we have. So we'll call this num arrows, and we'll make it a integer. And if you compile it, then we'll have a default value. We'll just set it to like 25 or something by default. And so instead of calling this, let's just go ahead and take this and collapse it to a function. And we'll rename this try reload bow. So we'll try to reload the bow if we have ammo. So if it comes out here, we can just add a little check at the beginning. We'll say get the number of bows. If it's int greater than 0, then we'll drag up for this and do a branch. So if the number of arrows is greater than 0, then we want to decrement the number of arrows. So drag it in again and search for decrement int and hook that up. And hook that up to reload, and then we should be good. So if we run this again, we should see the same result because we have 25 arrows. And the next thing we want to do is just show the number of arrows that we have left, like on the bottom left of the screen. So we're just going to real quick make a really simple widget for this. So if we come back here to the content directory and we right click and say user interface and we search for widget blueprint, we'll call this the HUD widget, like so. And sorry, I probably did that fast. User interface and widget blueprints. So if we double click on this, inside of here, we're just going to add a little display down here in the bottom left that shows you how many arrows you have left. So if we search for horizontal box and drag it onto the canvas panel, and we'll just drag it somewhere down here. And then inside of the horizontal box, we want to add 2 text boxes. So text box, or not text box, just text, sorry. Drag that guy in and drag another one in. So now we have 2 text boxes inside of our horizontal box. So the left one, if we click on it, we want the text to say arrows, and then maybe a colon and a space. And then this is going to be the number of arrows we have left. So we can just say like 5 or something because we're going to bind this. So come over here and say create binding. It will create a little function for us back on the graph side of things. So we want to be able to get the number of arrows that the player has left. So we'll say get owning player pawn. And we know that this is going to be the player, so we can say cast to first person character. That up. And off of this, we can say get arrows, or get num arrows, and hook that up to the return value like so. All right, and then the last thing we need to do is make it so that this widget shows up on the screen. So if we come back to our first person character, and we go back to our event graph, before we go ahead and reload the bow, actually, I guess we can just do it after we reload the bow. We want to say create widget, create widget, and hook that up. And the widget we want to create is our HUD widget. And the owning player is going to be the player controller. So if we say get controller, and you'll notice if we try to hook this up, it won't actually work because it says that a controller object is not compatible with a player controller object. But since we are a player, we can safely just cast this to a player controller. And I'm going to make this a pure cast since we are sure it's going to succeed. Go ahead, hook that up. And then finally, we can say add to viewport. So if we go ahead and compile, and I'm just going to save everything, go ahead and run this now. We should get 24 printing out at the bottom left, and you can see we have our arrow inside of our bow. So the next thing we want to do is be able to charge it by holding down right click. So if we come back to our event graph, back down to this charge function, we'll just call the charge functions that we already wrote for the bow. So drag on the bow and say begin charge when it's pressed. And we'll say in charge when it's released. Just like so. And let's go look at these again. I'm just going to double click on begin charge to make sure okay, so yeah, so it's running the timeline, but it's not actually updating anything about the bow yet. So in order for the bow to animate when you're being pulled back, we need animations. And I currently don't have any animations, but I can create them real quickly here, and I'll show you how. But if you already have animations, feel free to use the ones that you already have and just put them in place of the ones I'm about to make. But if you don't have animations, there's actually a really simple way to go ahead and make animations for a bow, as long as your bow has the correct bones inside of its skeleton. So if we come back to our assets folder and we look at our bow, and I'm just going to double click on this guy over here. So this is the default pose of our bow, but we can create animations from this really easily. So if you come up here to the top, you can hit this create asset button, and then you can hit create animation, and you can do it from the current pose. So it's basically going to take whatever pose it's in right now, which is just the default pose, idle, and it's going to create an animation file from that pose, which is what we want to do. So we'll do one from this pose, and we'll just add it straight to the content directory, and we'll call it bow idle anim, and hit OK. And you can see this is the animation it created. It's pretty simple. It's just one frame of the bow in this idle pose. But the one we want to create that's going to take a little bit more time is the one that has it where it looks like it's being pulled back. So again, if we come back here to our bow, we can go to the skeletons tab over here, and we can kind of modify it to make it look like it's being pulled back. So there's two things we want to do. We want to pull the arrow back, and then we want to kind of bend the bow. So to pull the arrow back, we'll just click on the string mid bone and drag it back somewhere like here, just so the arrow is still like barely over the tip. And then we want to bend the bow. So for this particular model, what I did in the demo is I bent bones 3 through 10, 5 degrees back. So if you click on 3, and then if you press space, it will switch it to this rotation mode. And then I came up here to the top and changed it to 5 for the snapping of the rotation. And then I just rotated it. And then I did that for all of the bones between 3 and 10. So let me just do that real quick. And again, you can rotate it more or less or however you want, or maybe you're not just a lonely programmer like I am and you actually have animations, and you can just use some animation file or get an animator to do this for you. But if you don't have animations, which a lot of people don't, this is a really good way to do it. And you can do it, you can do it more or less, depending on how much you want it to bend or what your model looks like. It's totally up to you. All right, so this is probably good enough. So once we have it in the pose that we want it to be in, we can say create asset and create animation from current pose. And we will again put it in the content directory, and we'll just call it bow charged anim and press OK. So now this is the animation that it created for us. And after this, we want to make a blend space between this animation and the idle animation. And the blend space will blend between how much we're currently charging it. So if we come back to the content directory, you can see we have these two animations now. And if we right click and say animation, we want to create this thing called a blend space 1D. So click on that. And the skeleton we want to use is the bow skeleton. So click on bow skeleton. And we'll call this bow charge blend space. And then if we double click on this, we want to change, let's see, If we click on asset details and then under access settings, horizontal axis, we want to change the number of grid divisions to 2, or actually just 1 rather. And we want to change the name of this to charge, I guess. Let me see what I named it in my other one just so I can stay consistent. Yeah, just call it charge. And then we want it to go from 0 to 1. And then we want to drag in the 2 animations down here at the bottom. So on the left, we want to drag in the bow idle animation. And on the right, we want to drag in the bow charged animation. And if we compile, or sorry, if we just save this, because we want that little green thing, and sometimes it doesn't show up, it gets a little bugged. But if you just close it and then reopen it again, it will show up. So there's a little green thing. You can see the idea of what I'm going for here. So as this green bar slides, the bow gets pulled back, and the arrow, as you can see, will go with it because it's attached to the string. So it'll make it look like the hand's pulling it back, right? So this is our blend space for the bow. And so this is what we want to effectively do whenever we are charging the bow. So if we come back to where we were before, inside of BP bow, we want to take this charge amount and save it because we're going to read from it inside of the animation blueprint for the bow. So if we right click and promote to variable and hook it up to the update, and we'll rename this to charge amount like so. Now, currently, it's not going to actually do anything because there's no animation blueprint hooked up. So to do that, we want to hook up, or to get it working, we want to hook up an animation blueprint. So click on the bow mesh. You can see over here on the right, there's no, the animation mode is set to use animation blueprint, but the anim class is currently none. So we need to create one. So back in the content directory, just right here is fine. We can right click and make a new animation blueprint. And we want to do it for the bow skeleton. So select bow skeleton down here at the bottom and go ahead and hit OK. And we'll call this AB for animation blueprint and then underscore bow. And then if we double click and open this up, this is going to be a pretty straightforward thing. Let me just look at my reference code to make sure I don't mess it up. Yeah, so inside of here, the only really pose that we're going to be using for the bow is the blend space. So if we drag in the blend space and hook it up, and of course it's asking for the charge, so let's just right click on this and promote it to a variable, and we'll call it the bow charge. Compile and save this. So now we just need to make it so this variable gets set. So we can do that inside of the event graph. So inside of here, we don't actually need this node down here, so we can delete that. We want to use skit owning actor, and we want to cast this to a BP underscore bow. And again, I'm just going to make this a pure cast since I know it's going to succeed. And from the bow, we want to get the charge amount. So charge, get charge, what did I call it? Get, maybe I didn't actually save it. What is it called? Oh, I called it charge amount. Charge amount, there we go. Back here, we'll say get charge amount. And we want to take the charge amount from the bow and set it to the bow charge that we created. And hook that up like so. Okay, so that's all we need to do inside of here. Pretty straightforward. I'm just going to go ahead and close this guy. So then back inside of the BP bow class, we want to set the bow mesh's animation class to the one that we just created. So AB bow. And if we compile and save this now, then hopefully, unless I mess something up, it should at least charge. So we play it and hold down right click, you can see the bow charges and it bends and it pulls back the arrow. And if we let go, it will slowly go back in based on wherever you release it. And I think that's pretty much all it does right now because we don't have the firing hooked up. But so far, so good. So the next thing we need to do is get it so that the arrow will actually fire when we call the fire event. So back inside of our first person character, down here in the fire event, we will go ahead and fill that out next. So we want to drag in the bow and again say get, and then we need to tell the bow to fire. So we need we need a function over here where we need to say fire, and oh, I already made that event. Look at me. So we'll call fire event, and then we want to automatically reload the bow. At least that's what I'm doing in this game. If you want to manually reload the bow, then just don't reload it after you fire it. Just have them press a key to reload it or do whatever you want. But for the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to have it so the bow automatically reloads as long as it has ammo after you fire it. So we're going to do a little delay here of a second, just so there's a little bit of time between when you shoot the bow and when it gets reloaded. And then we'll call our little try reload bow function that we wrote, which will, again, only reload the bow if there's ammo, so we don't have to worry about checking that again. So if we go look at this fire event, currently it's just empty because we haven't written it yet, but we can go ahead and write that down. I'm just going to move this so we have a little room. Okay, so inside of the fire event, again, we want to only be able to fire, just like we only want to be able to charge if there's an arrow inside of the bow. So we'll drag in our arrow and we'll say get, and we'll convert it to a validated get, so we can make sure it's actually set. And assuming that it is set, the first thing we want to do is we want to detach it from the bow, because remember the arrow is currently attached to the string of the bow, so that when the string moves back, the arrow moves back with it. But when we go to fire the arrow, obviously we don't want the arrow to be attached to the bow anymore, so we just want to call detach from actor. So this is going to detach it from whatever it's attached to. And we want to make sure that the location we keep world, which just means, keep the arrow wherever it is. Don't try to move it when you detach it. So we'll just say keep world for all of these. And the next thing we want to do is we want to change the state of the arrow. And to do this, we're going to need to write some code inside of the arrow class, but we basically want to change the arrow so that it becomes a projectile as opposed to just some static mesh that's chilling inside of the bow. So we're going to call fire. So I'm just going to hit C, make a little comment here to do fire arrow. And then after we do that, we're going to set the arrow. So we're going to drag in set arrow. And we just want to set it to nothing. So just leave it as set. And what this will do is it will set it to null. And so that will make it so that it fails these checks that we've added because we're firing it. So the arrow no longer exists as far as the bow is concerned. And then after we fire it, we want to call our little stop charge function up here so that the timeline stops. So we'll just call stop charge. Okay, so let's go ahead and write this fire arrow event so that we can actually start firing things. So we haven't done much in the arrow blueprint up until this point, but now we're going to actually start adding stuff to it. So come back to the BP arrow, and inside of here, we want to add a few functions. So, well, actually, we want to add a couple of variables first. I think it'll make more sense if we do it this way. So the first one we want to add is the bow charge amounts, because we're going to need to know that when we go to shoot the arrow. So if the bow is charged up a lot, we want the bow to fire, or we want the arrow to, go further. And if it's only charged up a little bit, we don't want it to go very far. And so we want to make this a float. And then the next thing we want is the arrow state. And if you think about it, the arrow can be in a couple different states. It can be just in the bow, like ready to fire, or it can be in the air, like flying through the air, or it can be what I would call unobtained, which means it's just on the ground, or it's stuck inside of a wall, or it's not in the bow, but it's not in the air, it's just on the ground somewhere. So we want to keep track of what state the arrow is in, because whatever state the arrow is in, it's going to have different properties associated with it. So to keep track of that, we're just going to come back here and add a little enum. So right click and create a new blueprint enumeration. And we'll call this arrow state. And if we double click on this, we can add the different entries. So the first one we want to add is actually just called none. And so this is going to be the state that the arrow is in when it's initially created. And then once the arrow state is set, it will never go back to none again. But it's just something it's like a default bad state essentially. But the real states are unobtained, which again is just when the arrow is stuck inside of a wall or something like that. And then in bow, and finally in air. So these are all the different states that the arrow can be in. Pilot that, close it, and then back inside of our arrow, we can add an arrow state. So variable arrow state, and we'll change it to our e arrow state type. And then that is currently all we need for right now. Compile and save all this. So we want to be able to easily change this arrow state from one to the other, and when we change it, we want the appropriate things to happen. So I'm going to create a little system to do that for us to make life a little bit easier using 3 different functions. So the first one is going to be for setting the arrow state, so we'll just call it set arrow state, and these can actually all be private. So if you come over here, it's like private, and I'm just going to add them to a private category because we don't really want anybody else calling these functions because they could mess up pretty bad. So if we duplicate this one, and we'll call it on state begin, and then duplicate this one and call it on state end. So basically what we're doing here is we're making this function called set arrow state, and when it gets called, it's going to call on state end on the current state, and it's going to call on state begin on the new state. And this is a really good way to manage states, regardless if it's an arrow or something else. It allows you to, make sure certain things are set, like certain type of collision is set when you enter one state, and also make sure that you undo things when you exit that state. So the set arrow state function, if we come back to that, obviously it needs to take in the arrow state. So if we drag in arrow state and say set, and we drag this over here, it will automatically add a pin. But we don't quite want to just hook it up one-to-one like this. We want to make sure that it's actually different, because if they're trying to set the arrow state to something that's already in, then we really don't need to do anything. So I'm going to unhook that, and then I'm also going to rename this one to new state, just so we don't get that confused. So we want to say if the new state does not equal the arrow state, we'll drag a little branch off of this. So if they're not already equal, then we can go ahead and start doing stuff. If they are equal, then obviously we don't need to do anything because it's already in that state. So if they're not equal, we'll call on state end, and we want to pass in the current state. So we need to make this function take in the state. So let's double click on this real quick. And under inputs, we're going to add an arrow state, and we'll just call it state. And we actually want to do the same thing for on state begin. So add an inputs pin for the state, like so. And then, so back in set arrow state, we want to pass in the current state because that's the one we're ending from. And then after we've ended that state, we want to set the arrow state to the new arrow state. So get new arrow, or get new state. So now we've updated the state, and now we just need to call begin state on the new state. So we'll drag in this and hook that up. Okay, so this is kind of just like a helper function. The real magic is going to happen inside of the begin states and the end state. So inside of begin state is where a lot of stuff is going to happen. So inside of here, we want to do a switch statement to figure out what the current state of the arrow is. If it's none, we want to do nothing because that's basically just like an invalid state. That should never really be the case. And if it's unattained, that means it's like stuck in a wall or on the ground, like ready to be picked up. We just want to make sure that the static mesh for the arrow is set to overlap all, so that if we walk over it, we can pick it up. So we'll say set collision profile name, and again, that's unobtained. We want to set it to overlap all dynamic. And that's really all we need to do if it's unattained. If it's in the bow, we want to set the collision to no collision because there's really no reason to do any type of collision detection with the arrow if it's inside of the bow. So we'll just say no collision. And if it's in the air, that's where we want to do a little bit more stuff. So if it's in the air, we also want to set it to overlap all dynamics so that we can check if it's hitting a wall or a player or something like that. So we'll do that real quick. Hook that up like so. But we also want to actually make it start flying through the air. So to do that, we're going to use something called the projectile movement component. And you can actually add that up here. We're not going to do it this way, but just to show you, if you search for the projectile movement component, you'll see it pops up. And You could add it this way, but if you added it this way, then it would always be there, and we really don't want it to always be there, because if the arrow is in the bow or if it's unobtained, it doesn't need to have this projectile movement component because it doesn't need to be flying through the air. So we only want to add this component when we're trying to shoot it. So instead of just adding it up here and like trying to enable and disable it at the correct times, we're just going to go ahead and create it whenever the arrow gets fired. So to do that, we'll just say add projectile movement component. And we want to save a copy of this so we can remove it later. So right click and promote to variable. And we'll just call this the projectile component. And then there's a few things we need to set inside of the projectile component so it fires the correct direction and the correct speed. So the first thing we want to set is the velocity. So if you think about it, we want the arrow to go in the direction that the arrow is facing, and we want it to go at the speed, or at a different speed depending on how much the bow is charged. So to do that, we can drag off of the projectile component and say set velocity. This guy down here. So set velocity. And again, we want it based off the forward vector. So we'll say get actor forward vector. And we want to take this value and multiply it by a higher number if the bow is fully charged and a lower number if the bow is not charged at all. So to do that, we can use the lerp function, which stands for linear interpolate. So if you search for lerp, we want to use the float one. And the alpha value is the bow charge. So if you don't know what lerp is, I'll just explain it real quick. It explains it pretty well in the comments. It says it takes the values, or it looks at the alpha value that you pass to it. And if alpha is 0, then it uses 100% of A. And if alpha is, I think I said that wrong. Yeah, no, if alpha is 0, it uses 100% of A. And if alpha is 1, it uses 100% of B. Probably made that more confusing than it had to be. But so it basically interpolates between A and B based on the alpha value. So these A and B values are going to be the speeds. So whatever we put in here is going to be the speed. Whatever we put in A is going to be the speed of the arrow if the bow charge is 0. So let's just say something like 100, something pretty small. But if the bow is fully charged, then we want the arrow speed to be something pretty high, like 4,000. And again, if it's somewhere in between, if the charge is somewhere in between 0 and 1, it's going to, choose the correct value between this. And so we want to take this value and multiply it by the forward vector. And that's going to give us the velocity of the arrow at the correct speed based off the charge of the bow, like so. Okay, and then the very last thing we want to do is we want to set this one bool inside of the projectile movement component that makes it so that the bow kind of arches as it would in real life, and it's just called set rotation follows velocity. You can just leave this false just to see what it looks like. If you don't check it, you'll see right away what I'm talking about, but for arrows we want to have this checked. Okay, so that's really all we need to do inside of this on state begin, and we just want to do one thing inside of on state end, because if you think about it, we're adding this projectile movement component whenever they set it to in it. Oh, I wrote in arrow. I just realized that. Hopefully that didn't confuse anybody too much. I need to go back and fix that. This enum should say in air, not in arrow. Sorry. Pile and save that. So back inside of the arrow. So yeah, when we're setting it to in air, we're adding the projectile movement component. So when we set it out of in air, we want to remove it. So in the on state begin, we're going to do another switch. And the only thing we really care about here is if we're leaving in air. And if we are, then we want to take this projectile movement component and it's called destroy component so that it no longer is a projectile. Okay, so now that we have this set arrow function set up and ready to go, oops, we don't need this. Now that we have this set arrow function set up and ready to go, we can make use of it whenever they call fire. So if we come back to our event graph, we can get rid of all this stuff actually. So, well, actually we don't need anything in here right now because we're just gonna, well, I'm trying to think for a second. Yeah, let's just make the fire event right here. So we'll say add custom event, and we'll call it fire. And the fire needs to take in the bow charge amount. So make a float variable for the bow charge. So the first thing we want to do is we want to set our bow charge to the one that was passed in. And then we want to set the arrow state. So drag and set arrow state. We want to set it to in air. And again, when we set it to in air, it's going to add that projectile movement component, which is going to set the velocity, which is going to cause it to fly out of the bow, right? All right, and one more thing we want to do with this arrow state, we actually want to expose this to the person who's creating the arrow so that they can set the state to whatever they want to be, or whatever they want the arrow to be in by default. So if we click this little eye here, and then come over here and say expose on spawn, it will actually expose it on spawn. So if we compile and save it, and then we go back to the bow, which is where it gets created, down here and reload, if we refresh this, you'll see it adds this little arrow state. And so now we can set that we want the arrow state to be in bow by default. Because remember, this is where we're reloading and we're adding the arrow to the bow. So we're saying we want the arrow by default to be in the bow. And that's going to go ahead and make sure the collision is set up correctly for us. Okay, so let me go ahead and come up here. We can do this to do now. So inside of or let's just delete this and then drag in the arrow. And we'll say fire. And it wants to know the bow charge amount. So we'll pass in our charge amount. And then I think we should be good to go at this point. So if we compile and save all this, and did that save? Yes, compile, save. And then we hit play. So it's still pushing me around. So, okay, yeah. One thing I forgot to do. So inside of the arrow blueprint, we want to set the collision by default to be no collision. So if we compile and save this now and we run it, there we go. We can walk around and we can charge the bow and we can fire the bow or let go a charge if we want, like that. Oops, I added some breakpoints because I was trying to figure out why something wasn't working. Let me just remove these. Sorry, ignore this. All right, so we can shoot the bow. All right, so now the only thing we need to do is make it so that if it hits something, it stops, and also that we can go and retrieve the bows or the arrows, because currently right now they're just going through everything. So to do that, we want to go to the arrows event graph, and we want to add an event for, oops, sorry, that was me trying to figure out what was going on. You don't need that. You should just have the fire event inside of here. Let me just make sure, yeah. You should just have the fire event inside of here. Okay, so we want to right click on the static mesh and say add component, and on component begin overlap. And so this is going to get called whenever the arrow overlaps with something. So it can overlap something in two different situations. One is when it hits a wall or something that it needs to collide with as it's flying through the air. And the other situation is when it overlaps with the player when he's going to pick it up. So we need to do a check basically to figure out, which one of these cases is it based on the current arrow state. So we're going to make a little helper function to make this a little bit easier. So add a new function and just call it handle overlap. And again, we want this to be private, so drag it up to private and set the access specifier to private. So we want this function to take in two different things. We want it to take in the other actor that it hit. So add an input for actor and call it other actor. And we want it to take in the hit result as well. So add another one for hit result and just call it hit result. So back in the event graph, we can just call this function. And we want to hook up the other actor to the other actor. And why didn't that actually, there we go. Set the hit result to the sweep result. All right, so inside of here, like I was saying before, we want to check, what case is this? Are we trying to pick up the arrow or is the arrow hitting something? So we can drag in the arrow state and do a switch. So the two cases we only care about are unobtained and in air. So if it's unobtained, we want to check if it's the player. So we'll drag in, or we'll say get other actor, and we'll do a cast to the character. So we're saying, is the thing we overlapped with a character? And if it is, then we want to add an arrow to him. So I'm just going to really quickly make a little helper function inside of the first person character for adding arrows. So I'll make a little function here called add arrows, and we'll make a little input pin for the number of arrows, just in case we ever want to add more than just one at a time. And we'll say, actually, let me rename this to something else just so it's not confusing, just num or something. And so we'll say we're going to set the number of arrows to the number of arrows, and we want to add whatever they pass into that, like so. All right, and then back inside of the arrow, we'll just call add arrows, and we want to pass in 1, like so. And then finally, we want to destroy ourselves because we're being picked up. So we'll say destroy actor. So that should work. Unfortunately, we can't really test it yet because the arrows just go through everything. So we need to make it so that they actually stop first before we can test that as well. So to do that, that's going to be off of the is in air. And the first thing we want to make sure is that it's not hitting the player. So again, we'll get the other actor, except this time we'll say not equals. And we will check that it is not the player controller, so get, or the player character, so get player character. And we'll do a branch. Okay, and then now that we know that it's not the character that we're hitting, we want to set the state of the arrow to be unobtained. So drag and set arrow state, and we'll set it to unobtained. And again, this will take care of all the collision and all that stuff for us and make sure that it stops moving. And then we want to set the location of the arrow to wherever it hit. So that's what this hit result is for. So we say get hit result, and I'm going to right click on this and break it, split struct. We want to take the hit result impact point, and we want to essentially set its location to that, except we don't want to set it exactly to this, because if you remember, the origin of the arrow is at the tail feathers. So if we were to set its position to wherever it hit, then it would be pretty much entirely inside of the wall because the origin is at the back of it. So we kind of want to set it to somewhere in the middle. So to do that, we can say get actor forward vector, and we want to take the hit result impact point, and we want to vector subtract or vector minus. And we want to subtract the forward vector times some amount, like 50, depending on the length of your arrow and how much you want it sticking into the wall or whatever it hit. And so this is the actual location we want to set it to. So we'll say set actor location, and we'll set it to that. And we can probably just teleport. And then finally, we want to actually attach it to the actor that we hit. That way, if the actor moves, like if it's another character or an enemy, if it moves, the arrow will stay with it. So we'll say attach to actor, and the parent actor is going to be our other actor, so get other actor. And we want to keep world, keep world, and keep world. Okay. So I believe this is now all hooked up, and let me just make sure I'm calling it, which I am. All right, so if everything works, or if I did everything correct, it should work now. So if I run this, oh wait, so there actually is one thing. You'll notice if I shoot it at stuff, it's still going to go through things, and that's because by default, inside of Unreal, things do not generate overlap events. If you want something to generate overlap events, you have to click on it, and then over here on the right, search for generate overlap events, and make sure this is set to true. So anything in your game that you want the arrow to go and get stuck inside of when you shoot at it, make sure this is set to true, or really anything you want the arrow to hit in general. this needs to be set to true. So if I set it true for this box and I set it true for the ground, then it will hit the box and it will hit the ground. So if I fire now, you can see it gets stuck in the box and it's actually attached. Oops, I picked it up on accident. But it's actually attached to the box. If I move the box around, you'll see it like the arrow stays with it if I try to push it. So yeah, I think that concludes the tutorial. You can see I can walk up and pick them up and my arrow count goes up in the bottom left and I just get stuck in the ground. Nice and neat. So yeah, I think that pretty much concludes the tutorial. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a thumbs up and consider subscribing.